You didn't check your phone this morning because you wanted to. You checked it before you were conscious enough to choose. That's not a habit. That's an engineered reflex. And the people who built it knew exactly what they were doing. Gloria Mark at UC Irvine has spent 2 decades tracking how long people sustain attention on a single screen before switching. In 2004, the average was 2.5 minutes. By 2020, her research recorded 47 seconds. That's in her 2023 book, Attention Span. She wasn't measuring willpower. She was measuring the effect of a system designed to interrupt faster than the brain can settle. In 2020, a documentary called The Social Dilemma aired on Netflix. One of the people on camera was Asa Raskin. He invented Infinite Scroll, the feature that removes the natural stopping point from every feed you've ever used. No bottom of the page, no moment where you decide to keep going, just a continuous pull with no friction and no end. He said on camera that he never intended it to be used this way. He estimated it costs humanity around 200,000 collective hours of attention every day. He said he was sorry. When the architect of the tool calls it a mistake, distraction stops being a personal failure. It becomes an engineering outcome. B.F. Skinner at Harvard figured out the underlying mechanism in 1938. He was studying animal behavior, not smartphones. What he discovered was a reward schedule so powerful, it overrides almost every other motivation a living organism has. He called it variable ratio reinforcement. You don't get a reward every time. You don't get it on a schedule. You get it randomly. The unpredictability is what makes it almost impossible to stop. It's the mechanism behind slot machines, and it's the exact mechanism behind every scroll feed ever built. Nir Eyal laid this out in his 2014 book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. Trigger, action, variable reward, investment. It became the design framework for an entire generation of apps. Then, in 2019, he wrote Indistractable, which is essentially the manual for escaping the system his first book helped create. The man built the trap and then sold the key. What the scroll does to your dopamine. Anna Lemke is a psychiatrist at Stanford Medical School and the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. Her 2021 book, Dopamine Nation, documents what chronic overstimulation does to the brain's reward system. The first thing she corrects is the most common misunderstanding about dopamine. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. That's not what it does. Dopamine drives anticipation. It fires when your brain expects a reward might be coming, not when the reward arrives. Arrival is processed by a separate opioid system entirely. Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan spent years mapping this distinction. He calls it the difference between wanting and liking. The dopamine system drives wanting. A separate system drives liking. They don't always fire together, and in chronic scroll behavior, they almost never do. Every swipe is a new anticipation signal. Something might be in the next post. The wanting fires continuously. The liking barely activates at all. You want to keep going. You don't actually like what you find. That gap keeps you on the feed for 40 minutes when you meant to spend 2. Under this pattern of chronic overstimulation, Lemke documents a measurable response in the brain. Receptor downregulation. When dopamine floods the system repeatedly, the brain reduces the number of dopamine receptors as a calibration response. The effect is that your baseline capacity for ordinary pleasure drops. Food feels less interesting. Conversation feels flat. Silence becomes genuinely uncomfortable rather than neutral. Dharmeshi at Michigan State University measured the neural signature of this in 2015, published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience. He and his team put high-frequency social media users in fMRI scanners and measured nucleus accumbens activation during social feedback. The nucleus accumbens is the brain's primary reward processing center, the same region activated by cocaine and gambling. Meshi's data showed the activation patterns were comparable. That's not a metaphor, it's a measured finding using the same neuroimaging equipment used to study chemical addiction. Lemke's clinical work specifies the recovery timeline. Signs of dopamine receptor sensitivity recovery begin within 72 hours of removing the chronic stimulus. Meaningful receptor restoration takes closer to 30 days. Those numbers matter. We'll use them. 300 strangers living inside your nervous system. In 1996, Giacomo Rizzolatti and his team at the University of Parma discovered neurons in the macaque-monkey premotor cortex that fired both when the animal performed an action and when it observed someone else performing the same action. The brain, at the neural level, didn't distinguish between doing and watching. These were named mirror neurons. Rizzolatti and Leila Craigero published the Human Relevant Review in the Annual Review of Neuroscience in 2004. In humans, direct single neuron recording isn't possible the same way it was in macaques. But consistent fMRI evidence across multiple labs points to equivalent circuitry. When you watch someone experience something, your brain performs a version of it internally. V.S. Ramachandran at UC San Diego called this system the basis of empathy and cultural transmission in his 2009 TED Talk. He argued it was what made human civilization possible, the capacity to learn from watching, to feel what others feel without going through it yourself. That system was built for a social world of roughly 150 people. Robin Dunbar at Oxford documented that 150 is the cognitive limit for stable human social relationships. The number matches hunter-gatherer band sizes, village communities, and military unit structures across human history. The nervous system was calibrated to process the emotional states of a village. The average American now scrolls past several hundred faces per day expressing outrage, grief, anxiety, contempt, and fear. Your nervous system doesn't know these are strangers. It processes their emotional states as socially relevant data. The empathy circuitry activates, and it never closes the loop because these aren't real relationships. There's no reciprocity. No resolution, just input continuously. Jean Twenge at San Diego State University tracked the consequences across more than 500,000 adolescents in her 2017 book, iGen. She documented that depressive symptoms, loneliness, and anxiety in American teenagers increased sharply and consistently after 2012. That is precisely the year smartphone ownership crossed 50% among adolescents. The correlation holds across demographics, income levels, and geographic regions. The mirror neuron system rehearsing mass media emotional distress at industrial scale is the missing biological mechanism behind her data. The finding that changes everything. I want to stop here and tell you something that, once you understand it, changes how you see every hour you've spent on your phone. You think scrolling is rest. Every neuroscientist who has looked at the data says it isn't. Marcus Rachel at Washington University discovered the default mode network in 2001. The DMN is a network of brain regions that activates when you're not focused on a specific external task. For years, neuroscience assumed this was the brain idling, doing nothing, a resting state. Rachel's research showed it was the opposite. The DMN is when the brain does its most important maintenance work: memory consolidation, emotional processing, self-integration, creative synthesis, planning. The brain needs downtime from continuous external input to run this cycle. The DMN is not rest from work. It is the most critical work the brain does. Judson Brewer at Brown University's Mindfulness Center published fMRI research in 2021 showing what the DMN actually does during habitual scrolling. It doesn't run the maintenance cycle. Instead, it activates craving circuits, the same networks that fire during substance cravings, the same signature. The brain is not resting. It is in a compulsive wanting state while the person holds the phone, believing they are winding down. Gloria Mark's research adds another layer. Her 2008 study, The Cost of Interrupted Work, from UC Irvine, found that after an interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to return to the original task. Not to deep focus in some abstract sense, to the specific task that was interrupted. Most people with a smartphone receive interruptions every 3 to 5 minutes. The math is brutal. They never return to depth at all. Johann Hari documented the cumulative picture in his 2022 book Stolen Focus. He interviewed researchers across behavioral science, neuroscience, and environmental psychology and found consistent evidence. The modern attention environment has structurally degraded the cognitive capacities humans depend on for meaning, creativity, and well-being. The person who feels chronically flat, creatively empty, exhausted despite adequate sleep, their brain is not broken. Its maintenance system has been systematically blocked from running. 3 sources, 1 diagnosis, 2,000 years apart. Here's what I find harder to dismiss than any single study. 3 completely independent investigators arrived at the same diagnosis and the same prescription. Different centuries, different continents, different methods, and they all described the same mechanism with the same precision. The first source is everything we've just covered. Skinner's variable ratio reinforcement driving compulsive seeking. Lemke's receptor downregulation from chronic overstimulation. Brewer's DMN craving loop blocking genuine rest. Mark's 23-minute recovery threshold being breached before it starts. The mechanism of attentional collapse described from the inside of the brain. The second source is 1,900 years old. Seneca wrote his letters to Lucilius in 65 CE while living in Rome, the noisiest, most stimulus-saturated city in the ancient world. Spectacles, gossip, political performance, constant social noise. In letter 2, he wrote, "A person who is everywhere is nowhere." In letter 56, he wrote, "First, withdraw from those who make you anxious, then from those who flatter you." He wasn't writing poetry. He was describing a specific functional problem, excessive social input, draining the mind's capacity for coherent thought, and he prescribed a specific structural solution, deliberate reduction of inputs, not forever, but as a regular practice of restoration. William James said it from the scientific direction in 1890. In The Principles of Psychology, he wrote, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will." He called it the most important faculty a human being can develop. He wrote that in the year of the telephone. He had no idea what was coming. The third source is 900 years old. Al-Ghazali completed Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, in 1095 CE. In Book 3, which addresses social customs and the harms of excessive speech and social stimulus, he describes what he calls the scattering of the heart from processing too many emotional inputs simultaneously. He uses a specific term for this state. He documents that it produces a particular exhaustion without obvious cause and blocks genuine inner perception. His prescribed remedy was khalwa, structured seclusion, not permanent withdrawal, a deliberate, regular reduction of social emotional inputs so the heart could return to coherence. Then the oldest source, the Satipatthana Sutta, preserved in the Pali Canon for 2,500 years, identifies vikapa as one of 5 fundamental obstacles to consciousness. Chronic attentional dispersion, a state in which the mind fragments across multiple simultaneous focal points and cannot settle on any of them. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi at the University of Chicago documented in his research on flow states, published in his 1990 book Flow, that sustained single-point attention is the direct predictor of subjective well-being. The Satipatthana described what blocks it 2,500 years before Csikszentmihalyi had an fMRI scanner. A Stanford addiction psychiatrist, a Roman philosopher, a 12th century Islamic scholar, an ancient Indian contemplative tradition, same diagnosis, same mechanism, same prescription, the convergence across 2,000 years and 4 completely independent frameworks is not coincidence. It's the kind of evidence that should change behavior. The Dopamine Reset Window, your integration protocol. Here's the practical part, not abstract recommendations. A specific protocol grounded in Lemke's clinical research and the convergence of practices we just documented. It's called the Dopamine Reset Window, 3 stages. Stage 1 is identification. For 1 full day, put a tally mark on your wrist or in a notes app every time you pick up your phone without a specific intention, not to make a call, not to answer a message you already know is there, just the reflexive reach. Most people discover they reach somewhere between 80 and 150 times. That number is your baseline. You can't change what you haven't measured. Stage 2 is the 72-hour substitution. Lemke's clinical research shows 72 hours as the threshold for initial receptor sensitivity recovery. For 3 days, every time you feel the pull to scroll without purpose, substitute a single focus activity with no variable reward, a 10-minute walk without earbuds, 1 physical page of a book, 5 minutes sitting without input. The discomfort you feel during this is the dopamine system recalibrating. Seneca called it withdrawal from what makes you anxious. Al-Ghazali called it khalwa. Lemke calls it the dopamine fast. They're describing the same process. Stage 3 is structured reintroduction. On day 4, reintroduce 1 platform. Set a physical timer for 15 minutes. Before you open it, say out loud what you're looking for. 1 specific thing. When the timer ends, close it regardless. This is Judson Brewer's RAIN technique applied to technology. Recognize the craving, allow it to be present, investigate where it sits in your body, note it without following it. The goal is not permanent abstinence. Seneca didn't leave Rome forever. Al-Ghazali didn't prescribe permanent isolation. Lemke doesn't recommend it clinically. The goal is restoring the gap between impulse and action. That gap is where genuine choice lives. The slot machine was engineered to eliminate it. The dopamine reset window rebuilds it. Gloria Mark's research shows the attention threshold can recover. The 47-second window is not a fixed trait. It's a calibration. The brain adjusts toward whatever environment you consistently provide it. 3 days is enough to feel the beginning of that adjustment. 30 days is enough to measure it. The question worth sitting with isn't whether the damage is real. The question is whether you're going to keep paying for a product you didn't consciously choose to buy.